Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Kirk Thompson. I am a realtor for Rural and Rural, but we are the Indigenous Coalition of Muscatine. Thank you all for being here this evening to learn about Truth and Reconciliation Day. Thank you all for wearing your orange shirts as well. It's great to see that we've already got some support within the community. We've worked really hard to get here, and thank you for your attendance. Today, it is my job to introduce our fellow board members and everyone else. Seeing's believing, so I want you to look at that beautiful picture right there. And yes, I do know how to pronounce all of their last names at this point. So me, I'm Malcolm in the middle, that tall guy there. That's me, Kirk Thompson. We have our president and our vice presidents, Justice Sack and Danny Zumwalt. Hi, Kim Warren. And Betty Collins back there. We have Naomi DeWinter and Keith Porter here in attendance as well. And last and not least, Brad Bark. So, without further ado, we're just going to go ahead and get rolling into the slides. Please save your questions for the end. And yes, thanks for being here again.
All right, thank everybody for coming today. We really appreciate it. Today we're going to have some very tough conversations in regards to some very heavy subject matter. So we just wanted to say, thank you for coming out today. Thank you for, supporting our little organization that has been around for officially a year now, which is pretty fantastic. We started this kind of from the ground up, and we are so very thankful for the board members and our community support throughout all of this. So thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it. So my name is Danny Zumwalt. I'm from the Listigouche Mi'kmaq tribe of Quebec.
And my name is Justice Sack. I am from Spaganagity First Nations in Nova Scotia, Canada.
So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and push forward with our presentation.
All right, so the mission of ICM is to educate, advocate, and create a safe space to explore Indigenous cultures, customs, and traditions. So before we begin, there is some terminology that is used that is now common days, is offensive. It is the term Indian. The proper terminology we use these days is either Aboriginal, we also use Indigenous, or Native Americans.
As we continue on with our presentation, you're going to hear the word Indian. That is just part of this process again, but we just wanted to ensure that that is a term that we don't prefer to be called.
So before we begin, there is a trigger warning, and if you do feel you do need to leave, that is definitely okay with us. We'll understand, because there is going to be talks about physical and mental and sexual abuse in a presentation. So if you do need to step out, that is okay. We understand.
We also like you to keep in mind that when we speak of these residential schools or Indian schools, that we have family members that went through this process. And sometimes we're going to have difficulties, and we want you to give us some grace during that process. Sorry, I'm like, look at it, sir.
All right, so the first thing I do like to ask people is, what do you know about the residential school system or the boarding schools? Is anyone familiar with it? One person?
Can you speak out? Ms. Kirk brings you the room.
Children were taken from their families. Children were forcefully taken from their families without permission, placed into residential schools, and forced to conform to the white man's way. Do you want to say anything?
Thank you.
So one thing that we do within our organization is to be able to go out into the community and provide educational opportunities specifically to our youth. We find that it's very important that our communities know that Native Americans are still here and still alive and still well. So one of our latest endeavors, we're going into the school system and working with kindergartners in the Muscatine Community School District. During our time there, they asked us to come in when it coincided with their Native American curriculum. And it was such a great experience for us because a lot of these children, for one, didn't think that Native Americans were around anymore. So that was a really fun time. And just like with those kids, we want to create that same kind of space here with you guys and let you know that we're here to answer questions and help guide, even though some of those questions may be a bit uncomfortable for both of us. This is a nice space of learning and community, and we want to make sure, that we're conveying that process.
So the first slide that we have here is going to be a video. It's a timeline of about 100 years into 5 minutes and 39 seconds. It's going to talk about how the Bagot Report began and how the Indian Act began, the 60s scoop. So it's just going to give you a little bit of information on the residential school systems.
For more than 200 years, religious orders run mission schools for Indigenous children, the precursors to the Government of Canada's residential school system. The Mohawk Institute becomes a boarding school. Run by the Anglican Church, it is the first government-funded residential school in Canada. A government report recommends Indigenous children be separated from their parents in order to assimilate them into Western culture. These recommendations influence federal laws and policies designed to strip Indigenous people of their culture and rights. Isle Lacrosse opens in northern Saskatchewan. The majority of students are Métis. The government takes authority over Indigenous people and education for First Nations. The Indian Act gives the Canadian government control over Indigenous rights and culture. The Act includes only First Nations as status Indians. It excludes Métis and Inuit. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald authorizes the creation of the residential school system, which is designed to isolate Indigenous children from their families and cut all ties to their cultures. The number of schools across Canada quickly climbs to over 40. The Government of Canada requires First Nations children aged 7 to 16 to attend residential school. Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce exposes the government's neglect of Indigenous children's health, including alarmingly high death rates of residential school students. More than 80 institutions are in operation across Canada, the most at any one time. 4 students are investigated for arson. Others reportedly cheer as they watch the school burn. This is one of dozens of fires set by students across Canada as a form of resistance. Inuit children are officially included in the residential school system. 6 schools open in the Western Arctic as the government takes over the administration of many church-run residential schools. Grolier Hall and Stringer Hall open in Inuvik, housing 500 students. More than 20,000 Indigenous children are taken from their families by government social workers and placed in foster care or adoption homes, often with non-Indigenous families. Adoptees lose connection with their Indigenous language, culture, and identity. 12-year-old Chani Wenjak dies after escaping from the Cecilia Jeffrey Residential School. A formal investigation follows. The all-white jury finds that residential schools cause tremendous emotional and psychological problems. The Canadian government takes over responsibility for the remaining schools from the churches. Thousands of Indigenous students are enrolled at the 28 residential schools that are still running in Canada. Phil Fontaine, head of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, speaks publicly of the abuse he suffered at Fort Alexander Indian Residential School. He calls for a public inquiry, which the federal government initiates in 1991. Gordon's residential school is the last federally run school to close. The report recommends a public inquiry into the effects of residential schools, including language loss and trauma. The government provides compensation to survivors, including the Common Experience Payment and a focus on funding and supporting Indigenous health and healing services. The agreement establishes funds for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC. Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologizes to former students, their families, and communities for Canada's role in the operation of residential schools. Provincial and territorial apologies follow in the years ahead. After hosting events across Canada, the TRC releases a summary of its findings. It includes 94 calls to action aimed at redressing the legacy of residential schools and assisting in the process of Canadian reconciliation. The New Centre holds a permanent archive of materials and testimonies on residential schools gathered during the TRC. The TRC characterizes Canada's treatment of Indigenous people as cultural genocide. Thousands of children died due to Canada's residential school system. More than 80,000 survivors and their families still live with its legacy.
Many people have said over the years, why can't you just get over it and move on? And my answer has always been, why can't you always remember this? And until people show that they have learned from this, we will never forget.
Some people liked the Indian school, and maybe some didn't. I can't remember the good things. I learned to write and read. That's about it. To me, I left it behind when I left. And they, my children, like to hear what happened. To them, it's just a story. I said, it's true. It is sad. You know, it made us feel so low because you're an Indian. You know what I mean? I think that was mostly hurt us more than the strap. Some of them fought back, believe me. Gladys Germain, former resident of the Indian school in Restigouche. That's my grandmother.
So the residential schools, they were built, as you can see in the video, that they were built for young children as young as 4 years old. The philosophy was to kill the Indian and save the man. These schools were run by churches and by the federal government, and they were mandated to go. If they were not to go to school, the parents would be fined, and they will also be in prison.
So when and why were residential schools built? They started in the 1830s and ran until 1996, which people are always surprised to hear that they ran until 1996, right? That's a huge surprise. The purpose of these schools, of course, was to educate and convert the Indigenous children to fit the Canadian and United States culture. These institutions stripped us of our traditions, custom, language, and culture. Their mission was to wipe away all of our traditions and to make sure that we could be whitewashed and reprogrammed.
So in Canada, there was approximately 130 residential schools, and there was actually one in my home province in Nova Scotia, which was the Shubenacadie residential school system. The United States had over 523 boarding schools. So together, that makes 523 between Canada and the United States.
Some people don't understand that we did have these residential schools in Iowa. There were 4 in particular: Winnebago, Toledo, Sac and Fox, which may sound familiar to some people as the Muscatine Nation, and White's Manual Labor.
So the first residential school opened up in Canada back in January 1st of 1831, which was the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario. So it was considered a day school for young boys until they opened up their doors for young girls for 1834. The little boys learned the trades and farming, while little girls, they learned how to sew and housekeep.
So the video did a brief summary of the Bagot report. The creators of these reports was Sir Charles Bagot, Ross and William Rawson, John Davison, and William Hepburn. This report was written with numerous statements on how to deal with Indigenous people. It's recommending how to train Indigenous students by specializing in manual labor and industries such as agriculture. It also suggests taking children from their parents would be the best way to achieve this assimilation.
So now that we talked a little bit about the Canadian residential schools, as you can see that there was over 500 boarding schools, which is the same thing as the residential schools in Canada. However, in the United States, they call them boarding schools. The three the most known boarding schools here in the United States were Carlisle in Pennsylvania, Haskell, and Sherman in California. So the first one here is Carlisle. It was founded in 1879. So this was it was formerly a military site, and sorry, I lost where I was. In former times, it was experimented with Indigenous education by practicing on captives in Florida.
All right, another school is in Haskell, Lawrence, Kansas. It is now the Haskell Indian Nations University. It was founded in 1884 as a United States Indian Industrial Training School, and it started out with 22 students. Since the school opened its doors on September 31st, students from the Poca, Sac and Fox, Shawnee, Kiowa, Comanche, Chippewa, Munsee tribes attended. Again, young Indigenous boys studied farming and general labor. Young Indigenous girls studied duties and sewing. By the end of the first school year, there were more than 400 students coming from different tribes from around the country. 1965 was the last graduating class. Winnebago, or the Yellow River, Iowa, it was an I can't ever say this one right. Alamaki, thank you. It began operation in 1835 and ran until 1840. They wanted to teach Indians certain techniques such as farming, reading, writing, and sewing. By the 1900s, that school was demolished.
So the education and the living conditions in the residential school system were poorly run. So they were stripped of their hair. It would be the first thing that would happen when they got to the schools, is that they were to cut their hair. And our hair is very sacred to us. We grow it long, we braid it, we take care of it. Overcrowding was also one of the biggest things that happened at the residential schools, where there's numerous bunk beds in a conformed area. Lack of medical care, which there was no school nurses. Many children died of tuberculosis and some other diseases. Isolation, which they were separated from their siblings. So if you had a brother, you would never see them again. Or a sister, you would be separated from them.
This way. This is the right one, right? Yes. So as we discussed again, the emotional and psychological abuse that occurred again in children as young as 4. As Justice said, our hair carries a lot of importance to us. When we braid our hair with intent. It gives us strength. When we lose a loved one, we'll cut our hair and put that in their casket with them. So cutting the children's hair was such a traumatic event, and that happened as soon as they walked in the door. Another thing is they were forbidden to speak their native language, and we're speaking of children that have only spoke their native language. If they would speak their native language, they would be beaten. They were sometimes allowed to write letters home, but only if it was in English. They were prohibited from using learning, talking of any of their spiritual beliefs. Most of their names were changed to more suitable white names. Most children were often referred to as numbers. They were ripped away from their families. This could happen at any time. They'd show up to your house and take your child. You couldn't fight that. They were told, no one loves you, you're worthless. Indians aren't smart and Indians can't learn. They had to forget about their culture and their heritage in order to survive. And I want you to remember that and think about that as we push forward with this, because a lot of our elders still carry that and we're afraid to pass on certain traditions and beliefs to their youth because of that, as a form of protection. They also were forced not only to experience abuse, but forced to watch other children be brutally abused. Some children obviously passed away at these schools, and some students were buried in the school cemeteries or mass unmarked graves, and most of these coffins were made by their classmates.
So the physical abuse was high. It was in, I believe, almost every residential school. You look it up, and there are a lot of survivors who say that when rules are broken or when a child was being disobedient, they would be punished. They could be whipped on their genitals. They can be spanked. They can be shackled to their beds. It was severely traumatizing to a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, wondering, why am I being beaten for speaking my own language? Why are we being treated like this? Many of the children were medically neglected. They would be kneeling on broom handles at some point, and a lot of the times that they would, when children, they would wet their beds. The nuns will come in and they will push their faces in the bed to teach them a lesson, in quotations. A lot of times, too, they were also put in the electric chair. They work dangerous positions or kneeling to the point of the blacking out. There are so many different survivor stories out there, and they're all extremely heartbreaking.
One out of every 5 students had suffered sexual abuse at these schools. Sexual assault, again, refers to unwanted sexual activity, including attacks and touching. Most of these encounters were done by adults who were set to care for them and educate the children. No restitution occurred for these abuses, but Arthur Plint was arrested in 1995. Arthur was a former Indian residential school dorm supervisor. Where's the other part of that? He was sentenced in 1995 for more than 2 decades of sexual abuse against children. Children were brutally beat when they tried to escape him. He bribed children for sexual favors with candy. He forced older students to provide victims for him. By the mid-1990s, most of his victims had either taken their own lives or died from alcoholism. Plant was sentenced to only 11 years. He was freed after 8 and died a free man.
We must do that. A federal cabinet minister, 1883.
Huon First Nation in Alberta. I attended Blue Crow's residential school for 36 consecutive months. That would be 3 years.
In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say that this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. A federal cabinet minister, 1883.
I remember them taking me away from my mother and my stepfather. And I can hear them telling my mom that that was the best thing for me, you know, and that not to worry, I would be looked after.
Our parents didn't want to worry us unduly and tell us and warn us that we are going to be separated for a long, long time with barely a visit.
I see him come around, Indian agent in a boat with the principal, then collect some children from the reserve. Mm-hmm. Then he would come back again, come and take some more.
So the next day, I woke up with hundreds of total strangers, my size, my age, and not knowing, what are they doing with all of us here? Why are there's so many of us here, and that's where a lot of my whole life really started to change, because I got strapped, I got beaten up for speaking my own native tongue. I even had my tongue pulled out and pinched,
My strongest memory there is when the little girl died beside me. She must have been about 6. I was scared why the parents were not there. That's what I was scared about. And I knew they wouldn't feel comfortable for not being there when their daughter's dying.
And do you know why they weren't there?
They were never notified.
Indian children in the residential schools die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs.
At that time, they never told us that our sisters were across the hallway. And I didn't know that for the longest time. Then I spotted my sister, Nora, and I was so glad and so hysteric, and I went running to her and I reached onto her, and just hugged her, and I was just shaking, and terrified. And I was wondering why she was pushing me away. I didn't realize that we weren't supposed to know that we both lived in the same place, and we weren't allowed to speak to each other. We weren't allowed to talk to each other. And I can remember the principal grabbing a hold of me by the hand, and I was jumping off the floor like that, and he stripped me. And he started whacking me with a long, webbed strap. He was setting an example that, if you do this is what's going to happen to you. And all the other boys were watching, and the girls were still going through,
Their education must consist not merely training of the mind, but of a weaning from the habits and feelings of their ancestors, and the acquirements of the language, art, and customs of civilized life.
Where?
So the long-term effects of the residential schools definitely, it still gets passed down from generation to generation. Our elders, they all have some sort of PTSD. We're living in poverty. They live with anxiety, anger. They turn to drugs and alcohol just to cope from their PTSD. And then when they do graduate from the residential schools, they go home and they don't they don't know who they are. They lost their sense of community, and they have to relearn everything. They have to try to relearn our culture again. They have to try to relearn how to speak to their own parents. It's traumatizing. When you're 18, you're literally pushed out the door. They don't help you find your way back. They just push you out the door and say, there you go.
One thing we've learned within the past, 5 years, I believe it is, that trauma is in fact generational and that we carry it at a genetic level. And this phenomenon is not new to our people. We were aware that these things were going on. We just didn't have the proper terminology for that. And when you go back to a home after you were a child that was taken, you're dealing with a parent that feels an immense amount of guilt who's also trying to cope with that. So they cannot provide those proper coping skills to these children, and then these children are having more children and passing on that trauma. Fortunately, our nations are starting to break that cycle and are starting to integrate, more mental health resources and drug and alcohol rehabilitation programs. And we're taking time together as groups to talk about the things and start healing. Some of you were able to attend the last event that we did when my cousin and aunt were here. And a big thing that we are doing on our reservation is a language acquisition program where we teach our kindergarteners our native language. And a big part of that is making sure that our children know that they're of their identity. And that is passing through to their parents and eventually back to our elders, who are now, after years of being traumatized and forced to, disregard their own feelings about their culture, are coming back in and working with our kids and teaching them how to make medicine and teaching them, our native stories and things that had been buried in the past. So we now have kids that run around on our little reservation speaking Mi'kmaq, and that's amazing. So we didn't want this to just be all about the bad, but I think the bad is a very important thing to discuss because a lot of people don't quite understand how bad this was and for how long. One thing about us natives is we are incredibly resilient and we're fighters. So we are rebuilding our communities, and right now we're breaking, a lot of generational trauma. A big part of that healing process for Justice and I is doing things like this and sharing stories and talking to people so that people can get a better understanding.
Migwide Demek.
Memories? They're very important. It can lead you to a right road or down a wrong road.
I think a survivor would naturally, as a defense, kind of take those memories and push them back into the darkness. However, Mi'kmaq culture is one of oral tradition, passed down from generation to generation. It's how we come to learn, how we come to understand, right?
So, of course, remembering the good things is important, but also remembering the difficulties. And without that memory, our family history, that wouldn't be.
We call that ancestral memory. That's important because it carries our ancestors forward with us.
Gestern nach Gisi Dike, Amushpa Migwide Democh, Dandet Wedidike. Dad was a survivor of the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School. He got there in late 1949, and he was there as a 3-year-old, actually. They said that he was too young for school, but he was still there.
We often saw kids being taken to the residential school, but you never thought it would ever happen to you. Then all of a sudden, they're taking you to the vehicle, and you're kind of, there's a little bit of reality to this. I'm going now. A red building with a huge cross on the front of it. It's the entranceway, the big granite steps, and the big oak doors. Some of the trees are still there. You could hear the rustle of the wind. Hearing the train whistles in the background as they're approaching through Shubenacadie on their way to Halifax.
The only thing I remember is walking up the stairs and then taken to the office and where we got registered.
My mom bought us these dolls, ball gown, dress, in this little plastic bell-shaped case. And when we got there, those things were taken away. We thought we would get them back when we left, but we never did. I was 4.5 when I went there. Didn't know that I was staying. So I didn't get to say goodbye. That was quite traumatic for me.
You're gonna move number 18.
We all had numbers. They wouldn't call us by names, they would call us by numbers, right? On one section was the girls, and then on the other side was the boys' side. But we never got to see the boys. We were separated from the time we entered there.
Yeah, there were other children there besides Mi'kmaq.
2 tribes here, Mi'kmaq and Willistic.
Dad said that at one point when he was there was a couple Mohawk kids that came and a couple Inuit kids from up north came as well.
Our routine was rigid. We were expected to get up around 6 o'clock in the morning, make our beds, go to the church. The church was a big thing. We had the nuns there and the priest and what they called brothers. No, we never were allowed to leave the grounds at all. It was not too much idle time, right? Of course, the kids eating whatever they're being served. Some of it wasn't fit to eat. We're all in bed by 7 or 8, probably around 7 because it was still daylight.
You didn't have very much interaction with your sisters or cousins.
When we seen each other in the hallway, we had to walk by and not say anything. And if we did, we were strapped and beaten. And that happened to my brother. On the way to church one day, we met in the hallway, and I said hi, and he said hi. He got pulled out of line and thrown up against the radiator. One of the male charges that were taking care of the boys was kicking him, telling him to get up. And I ran out of line and I jumped on him and I started fighting him to get him up. So we both got in trouble that time. But that's how bad it was.
Nui surimino na danteli ol nultik. Akal mesi was wa do di da nagamoyak.
They told you not to speak your language or else you're going to be punished. Yeah. Whenever the parents came to the school there, the nuns would monitor your visitations, I guess I call it, and make sure you don't speak your language. And you're only allowed an hour to visit them, and then they have to leave again, right?
I remember being told that we weren't good people and being told that our parents didn't want us. That's why we were there.
I remember crying a few nights, for my mom. And I would hear the other ones, little ones, crying too, right? You couldn't get up and console them. Because if you got out of bed, you got punished. I remember missing Mom, my dad, and my siblings. I miss the freedom, the beach. Yeah.
I think the point of, not just the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School, but residential schools all across Canada, the point was to make us white and to get rid of the reserves, to take away our language, to take away our culture and our customs, the way we did things, and assimilate us into Canadian culture.
When I was growing up, we never had powwows. We never had regalias. We never had songs. We never had dresses like this.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission described it as cultural genocide, but the Shubenacadie survivors, they simply called it genocide.
Whether you call it cultural genocide or whatever you may call it, it was a way to exterminate us, our core, our identity, to wipe that clean.
It wasn't until 1960s that they saw fit to consider Mi'kmaq people citizens of this country.
I never tried to leave. I thought about it.
There are some, families that were arrested at the schools trying to get their kids out.
He didn't want to go back. And so he saw the bus coming and he booked it up the hill. He stayed there until it was dark. And that's how he did it.
The school had students from 1929 to 1967. We were the last students to leave. I was cleaning out the sister's locker in her room. And way in the back, I found my Bill doll. I told sister this was mine. And she said it was hers. And I said, well, you know what? You can have it. I don't want nothing from here.
When
they went home, some survivors felt like they were treated as outsiders or damaged.
We've been brainwashed. Some of them don't want to be known as natives, It's pretty sad, right?
Kids that came back to Muscatine from Shobi School, they hung out with each other because the other kids would not, play with them because they spoke different. My dad, he came back and he spoke English, and he was shunned for it, right?
I think each generation dealt with it in different ways, and mine was to rebel to alcohol and drugs. Yeah.
My grandmother, and she was quite adamant about keeping our language back then, right?
What makes us who we are is our language. Who we are as Ulunok people is within that language. So when he came back, he started to speak the language again. Eventually, he spoke it fluently. So it didn't work. They didn't assimilate him. Mukawan da soldik dan badabek soldik dan wajidaik mada awan dan tijawan das wadamu tlis wudi menu wenta do ginu. We drove by on the highway. Dad said, "Det wajiyab nojigina muksiyap." That's the first time ever that I have a memory of the location of the school.
They were in the process of tearing it down when it burned. The way it was burning, it was like all those evil things and all those negative things, I think, were leaving.
It was mixed emotions, right? Yeah.
But knowing how much pain and how much horror that has caused our people and my family and my dad, I was kind of happy that it didn't exist anymore.
Although you don't see the building, the hill is there and it's just as visible in your memory as the school is. It's a horrible thing that school was put there. But couldn't be in a more wonderful site than along that Shubenacadie River. Mi'kmaq played a significant role in the making of this landscape prior to Europeans and throughout that period. And it goes back 13,500 years. It's a continuity. That whole history and experience unfolding on that river. Mi'kmaq haven't forgotten that.
pretty soon.
So that school was in my province. It was the Shubenacadie residential school system, and I don't remember the year, but it did burn down. As of right now, Canada recognizes it as a national monument, and there is a plaque there that talks about the residential day schools, and there's beautiful architecture there. And all those people in that video are from my reservation. So Doreen Bernard, she was the one with the hat, and she's such a wonderful lady. It was her great-grandmother who went to the residential school system. Her mother went to the residential school system, and she also did too.
A big part of the residential school system and the abuse that these children endured, many of them didn't survive. In May of 2021, archaeologists encountered 215 unmarked graves at a residential school in British Columbia. More than 5,000 Indigenous children were found buried on residential school properties on or around the area. Over 1,000 children were found in the United States. These children were never reported to government officials or their families. They just didn't come back home. In 2024, funding cuts for searches on unmarked graves are on the radar in Canada. So right now we're still trying to be dismissive and cover those things up. One thing I can speak of too, in regards to the United States versus Canada, is I encountered some backlash in regards to this, where some people said, well, that's not true, that didn't happen. There's no graves. That didn't happen, there's no kids. Yeah. And it's so bizarre to me, having grown up in America and being in an environment like that they were just like, no, this didn't happen. Don't look over there. Like, that's fine. Don't worry about it. Are we going to play this video? Go ahead. Yeah.
Antivirus protection that doesn't act like a virus.
So I talked to a psychic, and I want to tell you guys about it.
We are transferring you to your psychic. You will hear a warning beep.
In July of 1973, I turned 6. My grandmother brought me to town to Williams Lake to buy something new to wear. What I chose was a shiny orange shirt for my first day of school at the mission. We are here on the grounds of the mission, the former site of the St. Joseph Indian Residential School, where 3 generations of my family attended. When I got to the mission, my new shirt was taken away, and no matter how much I cried or wanted it back or protested, it didn't matter. I never did get my shirt back, and I don't have a memory of ever wearing it again.
Orange Shirt Day began with Phyllis's story at Williams Lake and has now spread across BC and Canada. The orange shirt represents the emotional, the mental, and the physical trauma that Indigenous communities endured during the residential school era and continues to endure even today. Following the confirmation of more than 1,300 unmarked graves near the former residential school sites across Western Canada, including more than 200 here in Kamloops, this story is more important than ever.
Every child matters. When I was in residential school, I felt that I didn't matter and that no one cared. We could be tired, sick, hungry, and lonely. There wasn't anyone there to tell us that it would be okay.
For all the children who survived residential schools across Canada, you matter.
For all the ones who didn't make it home, you matter. And for all the children today dealing with generations of trauma caused by residential schools, you matter.
September 30th is Orange Shirt Day, National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Wearing orange shows Canada is taking a unified step towards reconciliation. It honors our truth and hopefully continues to build a stronger relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples.
Wearing orange means standing alongside us. It means honoring our truth. It means walking with us toward a brighter future. Together we can remember and honor our past while we work together and build a better Canada.
An important back.
All right, so today is Truth and Reconciliation Day, also known as Orange Shirt Day. It is a day to remember the children who never made it home. It is a day to reconcile what has happened in the past and how we can have a better future. How can we learn from this? Also, it is if you in the video, as it said, in Canada is now a national holiday, so you will see everyone wearing orange in schools, and we have so much support from the communities by wearing orange and by recognizing that the residential school system is horrible.
I also believe it represents our resilience and our ability to survive despite, what has happened to us as First Nation members and as people from tribes in the United States. So when we look out and see you guys wearing the shirts, and it's really, really great for us because Justice and I are far away from our communities. And it is really great that Muscatine has been so incredibly supportive and has even allowed us a proclamation to declare this a National Day of Truth and Reconciliation for Muscatine, which is a big step. That didn't come without some pushback at times, but regardless, we are just incredibly thankful for this ability to share our stories and to have this wonderful group support us and to allow us the space to just share this journey with you guys. Oh, you already moved it. Okay, so what are we doing now, right? So we talked about all these terrible, horrible things, right? And those things aren't going to be erased. They're not going to go away. We're not going to forget about them. But what are we doing now? As I said, a lot of our communities are reinvigorating our students and our children through language acquisition programs, as discussed prior. As a result, our elders, again, are re-engaging with the youth and coming in and passing down traditions and teaching our young to make medicines and, feeling welcome again, because most of our elders would not step foot in a school. That was not a good place for them. So the fact that they're coming in and re-engaging is a huge step for our communities. Most of our reserves have expanded mental health services. We have healthcare services. We have, we have our own police force. Like, people are always so amazed by that. We have our own government, on our reservations. It's a wild time. So all these services are in place to, again, help support not only the survivors, but their children who have also endured, trauma as a result of that.
So how can you help and support us? The best things is to ask questions. There will be some awkward questions and some hard questions, but that is how we grow as a community. That is how we educate people, is by answering those tough questions. Taking part in Indigenous events such as powwows and gatherings, craft shows, showing your support by coming out and learning about our culture. And you can also show your support by wearing orange on September 30th. There's also the Murder and Missing Indigenous Women Day that is in May, by wearing red to show your support and alliance with us.
So everything we went through in our presentation will be accessible if you'd like to look through. Some of those videos were pretty lengthy, so we didn't want to play like an hour's worth of video. Again, this is the purpose of the Indigenous Coalition, is to provide educational opportunities. we just started not that long ago, on our year, but we plan to do more events such as this, along with bringing other Indigenous, writers, artists, speakers to our community so that we can have more exposure here. Thank you again so much, and I'm glad you were here with us. I apologize again. It's not a great thing to sit through, but we appreciate that you came for it.
Some very powerful things to talk about this evening. A wise man once told me that people are not brought together by their happy moments and all of the wonderful things that we see in this life, but people are connected mostly by trauma, and it takes coming together in those moments and with that traumatic experiences to create opportunities for advocacy and education and to bring us closer together. Each and every day I get to see, no matter what our differences are, how similar we are, and some of the horrible things that happened with the residential schools, unfortunately have happened time and time again. And it's important that we face these things head on versus trying to mask them within our history and trying to place them on the back burner, because that is what is going to make us great, and we're always stronger together. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. Does anybody have one?
First off, thank you very much for coming. I know that your experience and your presentation pretty much focused on the Canadian residential schools and what Canada has done to recognize their cultural genocide. Can you speak at all to anything the U.S. has done? Because I am not aware of the U.S. recognizing their role in the boarding school system at all. I mean, did I miss it, or have they done anything?
You didn't miss it because it didn't happen. So you're correct. So what's happening are things similar to this. We're bringing it to smaller communities. We're expanding. That is not to say there isn't acknowledgement, but we haven't gotten to quite that stage yet. Discussing how that affects our local tribal nations such as Muscatine and things like that would be a next first step for us, because again, we're both First Nations from Canada, so our side is going to be quite different. And as we've grown and expanded and learned more about local tribes, things are just radically different here than they are in Canada. So, I mean, even from, obtaining what we call our Indian cards and our status and blood quantum, and it's just radically different here than it is there. So I have faith, right? I have faith that we'll get there. But we reach those stages by having these small, courageous conversations, right? And then talking to other people and just expanding and sharing that knowledge. On that note, I'd like to also bring up the fact that they had talked about the fact that we weren't allowed to celebrate via powwow, right? That is, I wouldn't say recent, but it has again come back. And as we approach another Halloween, I really encourage people to, continue to speak on the fact that our regalia is in fact not a costume. Our regalia is handmade with intention, and it's a very sacred garment for us. So those are the little things that we can do as a community, is just to share those kinds of discussions, with our friends. We aren't here to name call, we're here to educate, because that is the only way that we get through ignorance, right? But our culture is not your costume. Please don't.
I don't know if you'll have the answer to this right now, but something that I've been grappling with is, as a community, we have been doing a lot of promotion of the Susie Clark story and Alexander Clark and desegregation of schools in Iowa. And 1868. And so I'm thinking about this, and I'm trying to find the right words to qualify that, because it obviously wasn't all children, even though that's like the argument was the state constitution was changed to say all children. And so I'd like to figure out how to, like, what the situation was for Meskwaki during that time, but also just how to like quantify what we're saying so that we're not misleading people that all of a sudden all kids got to go to the same schools in Iowa, 'cause, you know. So I don't know if you know anything about the, like, what happened in Iowa during like the late 1800s. But just to say that I'd love to figure out how to phrase that so that we're not misrepresenting the situation.
I'm trying to think of everything that you just said. You always say a lot of stuff to me, Krista, and I appreciate it because you make me think, and I need that. So since our organization is fairly new, we are newly expanding into, you know, our neighboring communities to learn more about them, and that's definitely one of those steps that we want to pursue and see ways that we can support our local Native communities and engage, because we definitely are advocates. We like advocacy work, obviously, and we're still kind of babies in our organization. But we are open to it, and I agree, and all it takes is one voice like yours to start those wheels moving, right? And if anybody can start it, it's you, so let's do that. Oh, now I'm involved?
Well, three things. First of all, last year the Meskwaki came to Muscatine to complain about the use of Indian symbols at the high school. That meeting didn't last very long. It's not going to change. Number two, I should mention, is last spring there were 12 children that were found in unmarked graves at one of the New York schools that were transferred to the Pine Ridge Reservation and buried by their community there. Number three is in the same article. They had people who'd been doing studies there, and they feel that the actual number of Native American unmarked graves is over 40,000. That's all.
Thank you, Dr. Che, for sharing that information. Again, there's a lot of information out there. You just have to look for it, and that's kind of another seed that we're trying to plant, just to kind of keep your eyes open. There's a lot of things that are under the surface that are going on or have gone on that tend to get swept under the rug, right? So we're just here trying to be a megaphone for those kinds of things. So.
So there was the number of how many didn't make it out. Do we have an estimate of how many children were rounded up into these schools over the years?
We don't have that number right off the top of our head. We don't know. That's a good question. That's a good question.
Is there history of registrations, like, that were ever kept?
There are some schools that weren't destroyed. And that's kind of the reason why they started looking for these children, because they were registered and they didn't come home. But as we know, when bad things happen, we try to cover our tracks, right? So unfortunately, we're finding them out through, you know, finding the mass graves and things of that nature. But that is a good question to discuss, how many people did make it out and how that affects, you know, our nations and in general. So that's definitely something we should look into.
I often hear many times within my culture and within my experience with the Indigenous community as well, how come you're still worried about that? That was 60 years ago, 70 years ago, 100 years ago. And to speak to generational trauma for a moment, I don't think something as traumatic as residential schools or various other things will ever leave anyone in this room's mind, body, or soul. I think that oftentimes we get very caught up in our own ways and what I like to call first world issues today and worry about why Verizon's network is down this afternoon and who made the best TikTok dance of the year. But oftentimes we don't take the 5 minutes, the 10 minutes to have those hard conversations with people that need to be had to continue to progress on the path forward instead of remaining stagnant. I appreciate you all being here this evening because it shows that you are taking that initiative yourself, and that was the purpose of our entire group, and that is what we continue to strive to do, is create a voice. My dad always said, you can't change the world. You may not be able to change the world at least, but you can certainly change yours. And by changing your world around you in return, you will impact the world ever so greatly. So once again, I want to thank you all for being here this evening. This is our third, and I would like to say successful event. Let's give another round of applause for Justice and Danny. These were very hard conversations to be had and to speak on, so I commend you all for doing so. Notice I was not on the panel, but it's very important to have those conversations, and I hope that we get to see you all at our next event. With that, before you go, please scan the QR code, check out our Facebook page. Feel free to give a donation. We love those. And we've got t-shirts over there still, a couple of sizes remaining, some cookies, and some fruit. If anybody has any other questions, I would say that you can stop by once we shut this down. And I don't know what Danny or Justice's bedtime is, but mine's around 8:30. So thank you all for being here.